Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you for joining us for our inaugural gathering of Research Bites. My name is Beth Awano, and I'm the program coordinator for both the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Human Rights Lab. The monthly Research Bites series is one of the many programs that we've initiated to celebrate the center's 25 years of engaging scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around the topics of race and ethnicity. Thank you to Tiara, our program administrator, for thinking up and bringing to life this series. And thank you to Anhalv, our media and marketing assistant, for running our tech for today. Congratulations to our guests who are enjoying their lunch on us from Grubhub. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC listservs to be notified of future Research Bites conversations and register for the chance to win lunch on us. Our goal for this series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal space where staff can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network with the hopes that we can find some shared interest and possibility for future collaborations. Today, we are joined with a very special guest, Honey Crawford. Honey Crawford is a scholar practitioner of theater and performance studies. She earned her MFA in creative writing at California Institute of the Arts and her PhD in theater studies from Cornell University, where she was also the New York Public Humanities Fellow. Her research interests include Black feminists of the Americas, public spectacle, and protest. Crawford specializes in Black diasporic performance with a focus on the Afro-Brazilian context, exploring intersections between ritual and self-making through a repertoire that includes carnival, media activism, radical theater, and the performance of everyday life. She is presently a collegiate assistant professor of theater and performance studies with the Society of Fellows in Liberal Arts. Please give a warm welcome to our friend, Honey Crawford.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you for everyone, excuse me, who made the time to be here today. Thank you to all the folks at CSRPC who are involved in organizing this. I love the intention of these talks of connecting faculty and staff with one another and keeping it informal. To that end, I will keep things relatively informal. I will share a bit about myself, who I am, how I got to this place, and then open things up, hopefully, to conversation. I think you can feel welcome to post questions in the chat or save them for after I share. It's interesting, the two, first of all, can everybody hear me okay? Yes, okay. And I should warn you that I have two Chihuahuas who have made it their life goal to disrupt these kinds of things. Right now they're sleeping, but please bear with me if it gets noisy on my end at some point. But I was gonna say, the two previous Research Bites are scheduled during my teaching hours, so I watched those independently. And it was really amazing to watch C. Riley Snorton and Kathy Cohen speak to their immeasurably impactful career trajectories. At first I was like, oh God, how do I follow them? But then also, truly, I think there's something interesting. There's an interesting perspective that I think someone in my position can share, working on her first book manuscript and working towards building that career trajectory. So I think that this might be, an interesting alternative perspective. I'm going to share a little bit about myself biographically, and then I will speak really broadly to the questions that motivate my work. I will speak on my first book project, my manuscript in development, and then really briefly speak to a future project or a second project. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can we see this? Yes. Great. Okay, so I earned Okay, I'll start off by saying that I started with a very sort of traditional Western theater upbringing and schooling at the theater school at DePaul. I'm a native Chicagoan. Um, and, you know, although it's very different from what I've moved towards, that conservatory BFA model of training at the theater school of DePaul, um, really influences the way that I look at the cultural and ritual performance that I study. After some time, I moved on to work on an MFA in writing performance, creative writing, critical studies in writing at CalArts. Highly experimental context, very different from the BFA at the theater school. And I should say all along this while, since I was quite young, I've been involved with Afro-diasporic dance, cultural performance, particularly with an investment in the Afro-Brazilian context. So that includes capoeira, samba, different styles of samba, what we call dança afro, Afro-Brazilian dance, or dances of the orixás of candomblé and Ifa. So when I began my doctoral work at Cornell in theater and performance studies, I was necessarily influenced by both this sort of traditional way of looking and participating in creating theater, as well as the highly experimental influence of CalArts, and also this deep investment in the rich Afro-Brazilian cultural performance traditions. So some questions that have motivated my work. I'm sorry, for some reason it's not letting me when I share screen. There we go, I have to tap it. Some questions that and topics that have motivated my work. One, this question of how Black diaspora performs, which I think of differently from the question of how Black diaspora is performed. In other words, how does the scattering of Black folks in the wake of the transatlantic trade influence how these traditions communicate within themselves, amongst each other, how they are exchanged, how they are mediated. I'm interested in the archiving, problems with the archiving and exchange of Black vernacular performance, the really troubling relationship to preservation in Black vernacular performance, and that includes dance, ceremony, ritual. And then the question of how these performance traditions, how the particular performance traditions of Black women reflect against their larger sociopolitical context. And then the big questions of what warrants ciphering, what wants to be deciphered, what are sort of the ethics and the conditions of deciphering traditions that have always held withheld a certain amount within them, or wielded, as I have here, the right to opacity. The celebration of a sort of interventionists who attempt to codify these traditions, and maybe the usefulness of codification. All of these are questions that trouble me. These images, by the way, represent where I was before I began even my doctoral studies. This one at the bottom is from Solidarity Park during Occupy Los Angeles, a series of capoeira and Afro-Brazilian public performance encounters that I organized under the title Occupy the Roda. And these were, on the one hand, to bring, relief, release, community, and entertainment to those who were camping out at City Hall, and also to sort of hold space for conversation, both corporeal dialogue as well as, dialogue. And this other one is during before I went into academia, I was a Los Angeles Unified School District English teacher at a school in West Adams in Los Angeles. And this was a group of teachers who were also involved in these arts supporting student walkouts that were happening at the time. I'm having a little bit of trouble with moving my slides while I share the screen, so bear with me, please. So the archives, so a lot of what my work involves is field research and engagement with particular archives in Rio de Janeiro, in Salvador, Bahia, and these are just a couple of the communities and archives that I work with when I spend time in Brazil. This first one is the Ipe Afro Archive of the Black Experimental Theater in Rio de Janeiro. Ipe Afro houses all the documentation of this first all-Black theater company, but much more than a theater company, called the Teatro Experimental do Negro, founded by Abdias do Nascimento, who is a very important figure in Black Brazil as a playwright, as an actor, as a scholar, and eventually a politician he was. This is from their I believe it's at 56 production of Black Rhapsody. So I spent a lot of time in Rio working with Abdias's widow, Elisa, going through these archives with Ipe Afro. One of the sort of touchstones of what would become my manuscript project is my field research with media activist collectives in Rio in particular. So, I don't think we have anything like media activism collectives in the United States, but these are essentially very talented photographers, cinematographers, and editors who are also activists, who are also quite involved with these mass protests, who make their work to disseminate information, to sort of move into the eye of the storm during protest and capture, the moments, the big moments. This photo is of Elisa Quadros, who's one of the founding members of Colectivo Mariachi. I lived with Colectivo Mariachi in one of my field research stints in Rio. Elisa at the time was on the cover of Veja magazine, which is like one of the biggest magazines in Brazil, and accused of all kinds of really absurd crimes and, presented as being some black anarchist, horrible person. She was a very benevolent, she is a very benevolent and kind and gentle human being and activist. But part of what I encountered in my work with Colectivo Mariachi and a lot of the media activist groups that I cite in my book is this troubling relationship between primarily non-Black progressive groups attempting to speak on behalf of the marginalized and sort of just assuming the voice because often, according to them, the voice of the povo negro, the voice of the Black people, is just not there in moments of activism. I push back against this, of course, in my work, but that's a little background on how I got there. I spent some time with the Mangueira Samba Academy in Rio again. This is Carlinhos Pandeiro de Ouro, the gentleman in the green. He is part of the Velha Guarda, the old guard of Rio's Carnival. I'm sorry, Mangueira's Samba Academy. He's celebrated for his skills in playing pandeiro as well as his samba. He's the father of this woman who he's embracing. Her name is Ana Carla Ladley. Ana is also a dear friend and really long time samba teacher of mine. She goes by the name Aninha Malandro. She dances against the grain of uber feminine passista samba, although she does it all, and she is known for her performance of the more masculinized malandro trope. So Carlinhos and Ana I've worked with over the years in sort of understanding the intricacies of carnival procession, the history of Mangueira, and what I believe, you can't get about all of the trappings of samba and procession and spectacle through anything other than practical application and immersion. And then finally, and I feel like I'm leaving out some other organizations and archives, but time is limited. This is a group called ABAMI, the National Association of the Baianas de Acarajé. And if you've ever been to Salvador, Bahia, you've probably encountered lots of Baianas de Acarajé. These are women who are typically very involved in the tejedos, the sacred spaces of candomblé practice, but also are street vendors who sell this wonderfully delicious fried bean paste fritter called acarajé in the public spaces. I was in Salvador during a moment when all of these, anti-World Cup protests that Colectivo Mariachi and my friends there were following, and while also this very sort of small collective of elder women of the tejeros of candomblé were fighting against FIFA as well for FIFA's attempt to exclude and remove them from the newly inaugurated Fonte Nova Stadium during the time of the World Cup, and spoke obviously to broader acts of removal against Black folks in the public sphere historically and also at that moment. So these questions around how Black diasporas performed lead to, outside of my manuscript project, some sort of practical and just other works. And these are just a few examples of recent things that I've been involved in. This first one is a Broadway production, which I call Ever Forthcoming, produced by Front Row Productions, Aaliyah Jones Harvey and Stephen Bird. Aaliyah and Stephen are very important pioneers in Black folks producing on Broadway. And I've been working with them since my graduate studies during dramaturgical research for, they both have a soft spot in their heart for Marcel Camus' cinematic adaptation of Vinicius de Moraes and Tom Jobim's original play, Orfeu da Conceição, which we probably are more familiar with as the beautiful film Black Orpheus, Orfeu Negro. Orfeu da Conceição, the play, it's important because it was produced in 1956 at the Municipal Theater in Rio by that same Black experimental theater founded by Agios do Nascimento. So it's a really, even though it was written and conceived by Vinicius de Moraes and Tom Jobim, it's really important to the history of Black theater in Brazil, gaining visibility, gaining attention on the big stage. And much of the original cast of Orfeu da Conceição, for example, Leia Garcia, who plays Serafina, if you're familiar with the film, Always Chasing After Chico Chico. Leia Garcia played, for example, Mira in this original production. So the adaptation for Broadway, Front Row Productions was working with Lynn Nottage, and I did dramaturgical research for Nottage in her really genuine interest in contending with both the popularity and adoration of the film, but also the critiques of the film. Many folks, for example, within Brazil, argue that this is not a representation of Carnaval in Rio, even though that's what it attempts to do. Nottage was very interested in the representation of female figures. She was very interested in how to find a medium between the beauty of the favelas and the cultural performances within the hills and the favela communities, and also the reality of lived experience in the favelas in this, in 1956 Rio, in representations of candomblé. It's interesting because Marcel Camus' film more so represents Umbanda, which is sort of a more syncretic, more hybridized, I don't want to say version of Umbanda, but a more syncretic faith that deals more so with Catholicism than Ifa. And Vinicius de Moraes' script had a stronger representation in the theater production of candomblé, and Nadic wanted to get back to that. Like, what does ritual and procession within the terreiros at this time look like? I should say Umbanda is also associated with Rio, or candomblé more so with Salvador. So it makes sense that Marcel Camus did that. These questions of, how do we communicate across sort of transnational perspectives as the Black diaspora, come up in a recent interview that I did, I guess towards the end of the summer, early fall, with the brilliant poet Douglas Kearney, with whom I studied at CalArts. He was a couple years ahead of me, and the genius electronic musician composer Val Gentil, and their creative partnership. So we talk about divination, we talk about their creative partnership, we talk about improvisation and methods of improvisation that sort of welcome, especially Val's perspective and investment in her familial legacy and faith, and Doug's capacity to just tap in and express. And also recently, I wrote the script for, this is with Cabinet of Curiosity, which is a group here in Chicago that makes sort of public site-specific processional spectacles. I wrote this for one of the directors at Cabinet of Curiosity. His name is Brandon Bowler. This was called Fields of Fire, and it was a tribute to the North Lawndale community of Chicago. And this is why I cared enough to do this, because it's a rich community, and Brandon wanted to create a site-specific performance honoring his late grandfather, Leo Roscoe Bowler, who, for whom this park, Bowler Park in North Lawndale, is named. So this was not quite devised theater, but somewhere in between, in that I wrote a script, and we worked with crump dancers and really brilliant scenic designers and cabinet in creating a sort of ceremonial event that was COVID safe and pared down, and just something that we could do to honor space even in these strange times. So I'll speak a little bit about my manuscript, Negra Demais, Overwhelming Performances of Afro-Brazilian Femininity. I guess most broadly, this book is identifying the unique position of Black women, often celebrated, often in problematic ways, as being sort of the preservers and the protectors of cultural performance, ritual performance, vernacular performance. And I want to I'm troubled by sort of the containment implied by preservation, the limitations, the temporal and sociospatial limitations that preservation implies. And addressing examples of public performance and vernacular performance that engage in aesthetics of excess, abundance that sort of promise to be too much. And that's how I land on this term negra demais, which we could understand as, black meaning negra meaning black and female, demais meaning too much, but could be expressed sort of in the celebration, like you're too much, like I love it, you're too much, and also you're too much, hold off, you're too much. So the so too black and so too black and feminine of negra demais, I think speaks to a historic and pervasive ambivalence towards the cultural contributions of Black women in these spaces. And I land on this gerund of overwhelming. First of all, I situate overwhelming in body. So it's different than transgression for me. It's the notion that the spectator is sort of perplexed and preoccupied and frozen and fixated with the creative and transgressive potentials of these women as cultural agents, but also that the possibility that the performer carries within her body the potential to be too much and to overwhelm. And of course, my ultimate argument is that the works of these women are never too much, can never be too much, but can certainly threaten to rattle status quo. So I guess I'll go through some chapters. So in my first chapter, it's titled Reflexive Fixation in the Turning Wind. I address filmmaker Glauber Rocha's first film called Barra Vento, which was released in 1962. I should say that there's a through line in this project of the non-Black, and I say non-Black because it's important to note that, race and Blackness are constructed just differently than what we might take for granted in the United States perspective. So Glauber Rocha is from Salvador, from the state of Bahia, but non-Black, and directs this film with his collaborator, Luis Paulinho dos Santos, taking initially a very sort of ethnographic approach. And in that approach, in fact, at the beginning, and at the film's conception, Luis Paulinho dos Santos was the director, and Glauber Rocha was just there on production. But in this very ethnographic approach, somewhere in the process, Rocha became quite invested in his position as a progressive radical, free the Black people from their state of being, their marginal state of being in Bahia. But it gets quite xenophobic. For example, the opening credits of the film describe, like on the coast of Bahia, there are these Black fishermen, and they are paralyzed by their practice of candomblé. They are illiterate, and they allow themselves to be eternally exploited because of their dealings with feitiço. And feitiço means sort of spell or sorcery. And the film eventually, the production eventually led to this battle of wills between Paulinho dos Santos and Glauber Rocha, where Paulinho dos Santos handed over the film to Rocha and said, I let go. He was much more so invested in documenting and sort of reverence of these cultural traditions, whereas Rocha was more interested in capturing and positioning these cultural traditions as part of his argument for progress now, freedom now, radical intervention on behalf of Black folks, and particularly Black women on the coast of Bahia. So there's a through line, I think, throughout the book that deals with you know, the well-meaning or not so well-meaning interventionists, and how, you know, from Rocha to positivism's influence on Brazil, the notion of, you know, order in progress, or is Juscelino Kubitschek, president's mission of, you know, let's get 50 years of progress in 5 years. Let's get the progress in. Even to, you know, Marxist ideology and the protests of 2013, these, you know, media activist groups wanting to work and make quick, rapid progress happen on behalf of the povo negro, who are, even in 2013, I was still hearing all of this language of, you know, where are the Black people of Brazil at the protests? They're underrepresented. Well, it's because they're illiterate, they're uneducated, they can't speak for themselves. It's our responsibility as sort of an elite minority to speak on their behalf. So I go through Rocha's management of female figures, his representation of candomblé practice, and his obsession with the notion of feitiço, both in the narrative and his visual sensibility. And his visual sensibility as a novice filmmaker is genius. I can't take that away. And for that reason, Barraventos, for example, when folks go doing work similar to what I did for Black Orpheus, sort of looking for primary source material from the mid-20th century that represents the terreiros of candomblé, or these cultural practices that have, you know, very rare examples of photographic, certainly very rare examples of cinematic or film documentation. Barravento, fictional film, is often sort of handled as primary source material because of that ethnographic eye that they entered with, and also just because it, you know, it's sometimes all there is. In my second chapter, I look at Carolina Maria de Jesus, who is a very important figure if you're not familiar with her. She was a woman of the favelas of Sao Paulo, incredibly poor, sort of the lowest rung as a Black woman, but also even within, you know, her peripheral community, the poorest of the poor. Carolina was a garbage picker, a catadora, a garbage picker, who would, and also a writer, but she would go out on these daily excursions to collect scraps of food, scraps of paper, which were really important to her as a writer. Anything that she as a catadora could recycle or sell to sustain and support her children within her community. And her, on these scraps of paper, sometimes she, you know, score a notebook. So she has her archive has quite a number of tattered notebooks, but also just these scraps of paper where she would write anything from poems to bits of dramatic text, to narratives and sambas, but most notably, she collected her diaries, her daily entries and comments on life as, quote unquote, a favelada, life from her social position. She was incredibly smart, and she offers some of the most pointed and honest and curt reflections on the political handling of Black folks in Sao Paulo and Rio. I'm sorry, in Sao Paulo and Brazil, more largely. And in 1959, she was discovered by a writer with the Cruzeiro Sao Paulo magazine named Adelio Dantas. She was arguing with a bunch of, which was common for her, arguing with a bunch of men on a playground about their mistreatment of children. And she said, you know, if you don't stop, I'm going to put you all in my book, in my diary. And Dantas, you know, sort of asked her what was going on. And within, I think, a week, her first short collection of diary entries was published in the Cruzeiro. sort of insert, sort of magazine insert. Dantas quickly collected and published. This is where we get the narrative of the well-meaning interventionist, radical progressive interventionist on behalf of the Black woman. Dantas quickly collected and published her first collection of diaries called Quarto de Despejo. Literal translation of Quarto de Despejo means garbage room. The book was published in English with an unfortunate translation as Child of the Dark. I say that because Quarto de Despejo, garbage room, is representative of this sort of metaphor of social structure that Jesus argues throughout her diaries, where she says, you know, the white, the middle class, the elite represent the salon or the living room, and we, the favelados, we are the garbage room in the back of the house where, you know, Brazil hides away their filth and neglect. And in this chapter, I deal with her really troubled relationship with the press. I deal with her performance of everyday life, her performance of self-making. After the publication of her book, she was inundated. She was inundated with requests to photograph her image for media, and she went on this path of having a really troubling relationship with photographers and television media in their attempts to sort of eternally represent her as a favelada, or at least a sort of very docile and passive woman who just feels very fortunate to have come up out of poverty. And Jesus, as this article and photograph kind of show, you know, much to the chagrin of her Marxist friends, was very much into the decadence of it all, and doing too much, being everything that she wanted to be. So I traced Jesus' non-normative performance of femininity, her refusal of marriage, her eternally, so she ended up back in the favela, and she's sort of been historicized as a cautionary tale, but her sort of refusal to accept the impression that was imposed upon her. Shaka. I'm sorry, my dogs. Shaka and Rufus, my dogs. Pushing through, so my third chapter, this focuses, it gets very presentist, but also reflects back to that similar period of the mid-20th century in a study of the representation and the political agency of the Baianas de Acarajé, to whom I spoke earlier. So while I was in Salvador, this movement for the Baianas, pushing back against FIFA and demanding their inclusion in the Fonte Nova, I addressed their methods of protest against those of their, media activist, anarchist, young, more privileged counterparts who were flooding the streets of all of these city centers, arguing, "Não vai ter Copa," there will not be a World Cup, we will not have a World Cup. And at the same time, this small collective of women were saying, yes, we need to have a World Cup because this is how we make our livelihood. This is how we have fed our children for decades. And not only will there be a Copa, but we are essential to the cultural fabric of Salvador. So we will be at the center of it. And their negotiations and their battle with FIFA. You know, I'm very interested in the ways that the protests of the Baianas, but also throughout this book, the resistant performances of Black women in Brazil do not always align with the radicality assumed by their counterparts, and look out for self, and are often about livelihood and self-preservation and self-realization. So I study, their methods of protest, but also the legacy and the history of the Baiana Jacaraje. So it's a role that, that goes back to captivity in the gañadeiras of the public sphere of Salvador, the earners. So these would be gañadeiras would be women, but gañaderos also men, but enslaved folks who were sent out to sell and to come back and at the end of a day of selling and hand over their profits to their captors. And in some instances, they were incentivized by the ability to keep a small portion for themselves to improve their quality of life, but also to possibly and often save towards their own manumission. And as more gañadeiras became or were able to purchase their own freedom, this way of saving, earning towards manumission was exercised in support of maroon colonies or folks who had escaped but needed to remain free. And then also looking back to that period in the 20th century, I study the Baianas as sort of agents of cultural memory against the exportation of the image of the Baiana through Dorival Caymmi's sambas and his collaborations with Carmen Miranda. So if you're familiar with Miranda and the lady in the tutti frutti hat, and Boom Chicka Boom Boom, and a big banana headpiece, those are all designed, crafted, and rehearsed as her sort of masquerade performance of the Baiana. So how the Baiana's image was able to be exported with the extraction, with the removal of Black womanhood towards immense profit, of course. All of the ambivalence tied up in that. And really quickly, my final chapter deals with, it's titled Remembering How We Remember, deals with memorialization, violence against Black women, the assassination of Marielle Franco. This is Mangueira Samba Academy, the academy that I said that I do ongoing work with Ana Lately and Carlinhos Pandeiro Gioro. Their 2019 winning procession, honoring not just Marielle, but so many Black women figures who have been done wrong by the state. And reflecting this procession against the 1962 Mangueira procession titled Casa Grande e Senzala. It's titled after Gilberto Freire's really problematic Masters and the Slaves book and theory of, which basically sets up this, the myth of racial democracy that, because captivity looked different in Brazil, it was less violent, and we don't deal in racism in the ways that the United States does. And, we are a racial democracy, we are a tropical paradise. This 1962 Casa Grande e Senzala procession was important in that it came at a time when Mangueira and another Samba Academy, Salgueiro, were beginning to sort of move from, honoring the history, the legacy, the colonial past of Brazil, and to start even dealing with questions of race, even addressing race. And of course, from there, Carnival is such a space of projecting Afrocentricity, and always has been. But this procession in 1962 was pivotal. So I read those against each other. And then super, super quickly, because I don't know how I'm doing for time. So currently I'm teaching a course on Catherine Dunham. And I share this because I'm in terms of like future project where I'm going, I've been looking into the archives of Mercedes Batista and Catherine Dunham. Batista was, you know, the grand dame of Afro-Brazilian dance, just like Catherine Dunham, you know, has been so important to us. But both Dunham and Batista in their time were celebrated as incredibly skilled ballerinas who also had this immersive knowledge of the vernacular, of the Afro vernacular traditions, and were able to bring these traditions to the proscenium, were able to codify, in both cases, able to create and craft a technique through their codification. And also both had, intentionally or not, sort of major political impacts on each other's nations. So, for example, Catherine Dunham, in her time in Brazil, and it's interesting because this photo is from choreography that she did before she had ever been to Brazil, which is not like Catherine Dunham. But when she spent time in Brazil in the early 50s, she was refused service at a hotel. And of course, this was upsetting, but also because of the myth of racial democracy, this idea that we don't do segregation like in the United States, you will be treated differently here, was really upsetting with her. Long story short, eventually the Alfonso law, the Ley Alfonso, which makes overt public expressions of racism criminal and punishable by law, was passed in response precisely to Catherine Dunham's experience in Brazil. Mercedes Batista eventually came to the United States and studied and collaborated with Dunham and was quite involved with the civil rights movement of the United States. So I'm interested back to this question of how diaspora performs, you know, how intellectually and aesthetically and creatively in a very sort of practical cultural sense, how these two really important figures engaged in a diasporic exchange. I think I maybe might be talking too long, so I'd like to open it up to questions or conversation now.
So I asked the question, I put it in. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, by the way. I found it really insightful. I put a question in the chat, but it's specifically about the role of samba and sort of what is the role of samba as it relates to Black identity formation in Brazil? Like, how does that sort of articulate in Brazil?
Well, that's a great question. I can't tell who's talking because I'm on gallery.
It's Jewel.
That's a great question. It's interesting. So samba is it's dance, but it's also, you know, the musical form. You know, it's the rhythms, it's the lyricism, it is the dance, but even within the lyrics, and the music and the dance, there are all these different forms of samba, right? So, for example, within the terreiros of candomblé, within the sort of northeastern context, you have samba de roda, which can be quite sacred and performed, you know, internally for ceremony and celebration, and also quite secular and performed in the public spaces, sort of opening it up. So all the styles have these different valences, right? And then you have the pasista samba, sort of the big feather samba no pé that you would associate with Carnival. And then, of course, the lyricism in the music. Samba is derivative of a dance form called jongo, which is one of those forms, like capoeira, like so many sort of traditions of the senzala, of the barracks of captivity throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States, throughout the Americas, were believed to have been, to have survived the Middle Passage and been really essential to daily survival and just, holding it together throughout captivity, bringing folks together. To that end, as a child of Jongo, samba is incredibly important to not just Black identity, but to sort of legacies of survival. And then, of course, the lyrics of samba often speak to anything from, very pointed lyrics of survival to, kind of similar to the blues, like "Tá ruim, mas tá bom," like it's bad, but it's okay. Like everything's bad, but we're fine. And one of the conversations I have often with Ana, and Ana is a very important figure Ana Malandro in contemporary samba, in that she's founded the International Samba Congress, and she's just a force. But one of the conversations that I often have with Ana is that, whatever style, however you find samba, it's like the blues in that you're working through all the pain, but it's release. And I'm talking purely about the movement of the feet, the rolling, shifting of the hips, and the shifting of the arms. It's working through and sort of getting it out of the body. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Sally.
Hi, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. It's nice to learn about your personal and academic trajectory. On one of my visits to Brazil, in São Paulo, somebody invited me to a candomblé ceremony. And maybe that's one of the things that really helped me understand what syncretism is. Because the priest was Black, the Orisha was Black, but the leader in the ceremony was white. And when I look at the membership at the ceremony, the majority of people were non-Black.
Mm-hmm.
And the attire was more in the style of what medieval, well, not so medieval, early modern Portuguese colonists than anything African. And there was a Nigerian there. The priest was very kind to me. He explained to me that they were perpetuating traditions, Yoruba traditions. And I asked the Nigerian if he had experienced that, and he said no. And as a matter of fact, I'm very much interested in this. And I'm here because I bring them products that they need from West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any kind of explanation for that?
Yeah. I don't know if I have an explanation, but I have a lot of opinions. So I'm not surprised that you were in Sao Paulo and this happened, because geographically, Sao Paulo being in the south, and sort of the xenophobia and the sort of condescension towards Bahia and the Northeast is I mean, there's nothing profound about me saying this, but it's just pervasive.
But in restaurants, they promote the food from Bahia.
And this is the ambivalence that I grapple with and that I'm addressing, I think, in this book, is this at once, adoration, promotion. They say the Baianas are the postcard picture of Salvador, right? They're tourist attractions. We need them. It's the culture, it's the food, it's the everything. but then the immediate xenophobia and the express xenophobia that you encounter in conversation, but also in creative works like Baja Vento. So, you know, Glauber Rocha being a Baiano, but non-Black, is at once saying like, look at all this culture, it's beautiful, but also saying they're illiterate, we have to speak for them, right? And you know, I'm kind of coming down on Sao Paulo, but even in Salvador, even in Bahia, this xenophobia and this sort of, I guess, religious intolerance, faith intolerance,
Yeah.
is overt. Then that syncretism, like the more syncretic, the better, because the further we can get away from it. And it's really about ambivalence, because when you push back and if you argue back, I believe if you argued back, you would have eventually met the sort of the gauntlet of, you know, like everybody in Brazil has a Black grandmother. You know, like we're all because we all have a Black grandparent. So how dare you say I'm not? But it's, you know, it's obviously convenient, and when it serves you, to claim and assume Blackness. And this is where it's important for me as a non-Brazilian to think about how race is constructed differently. But also it's really important to me to be really conscious of the lived experience of Blackness, and how that lived experience is at once punished and sort of wielded against you. So for example, Abdias do Nascimento and the folks from the Black experimental theater in their time, some of the greatest criticism that they faced was this like idea of like, how dare you be a Black experimental theater, Brazil, we're all Black, we all come from the same, this is all of our culture, it's not just your cultural heritage, it's all of ours. And I think that's kind of, you know, similar to what you faced in Sao Paulo, unfortunately. It's this sense of like, it belongs to us as a nation, but also we don't value Black folks or Black experience, but also, you know, we're speaking on behalf of it. It's incredibly confounding. Even on Thanksgiving, this past Thanksgiving, the National Day of the Baianas Yacaré, Thanksgiving, and I was following all of the wonderful thing about COVID is that everything's virtual. So I was attending all of these virtual seminars in celebration, and some of the things that were coming up over and over again was the number of Baianas who are no longer involved in the terreiros of Candomblé because of the xenophobia and the racial intolerance. The number of Baianas who were, you know, identifying with these evangelist communities and sort of making it clear and express in their public presentation, like, I'll wear the dress, but I don't worship the Orishas. I don't practice it. You know, this is sort of the mission. This tension, this ambivalence is sort of the mission of this book, to at least address it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's the last question that we have time for. Thank you so much, Dani, for giving that wonderful presentation, and to the others who asked questions. Those are really great questions to further discussion. If you want to be notified of future conversations, you may join our listserv, CSRPC, or the Research Bites listserv. We would love to have you come again. And yeah, please stay in touch. We'll have the recording on YouTube if you'd like to go back and take a closer look at the images and think more deeply about what's been talked about today. But thank you again, honey, for that wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming.